Okay, so here we go. So as we're getting started tonight, once again, this is To Live as Christ, Paul's journey, Acts 9 through 28, what kind of people we'll be following. Tonight we're going to start with Saul, the early years. And so like I said, trying to really get into who Paul is and understanding his background, understanding where he came from, and what made Paul Paul when he finally appears on the scene. And so we're going to get started with this tonight. And so starting with the first thing, really understanding Paul and his beginnings is looking at Paul's hometown. Paul was born, likely born between 5 BC and 5 AD. We don't have an exact date because, they didn't really have ancient birth certificates like we have now, so we don't have an exact date and year as to when he was born. But tradition holds sometime in that 10-year time span was when Paul was born. And he was actually, if you look at those dates, the dates for the birth of Jesus are between 4 BC and 1 or 2 AD. So Paul was a contemporary of Jesus. He was born about the same time. So he would have been probably around 25-ish whenever Jesus was actually ministering. And so we have Paul, who was raised and lived during the time of Jesus when Jesus was growing up and ministering on the earth. He was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, which you can see it here on the map. Right there in Tarsus, way down here is Jerusalem, Nazareth, where Jesus lived. And so he was way on the northern part of the empire. So some of the things for that, Acts 21:39, here's Paul saying, no, I'm a Jew, a citizen of Tarsus in Cilicia, which is an important city. And then Paul said, I am a Jew born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, which is Acts 22. So Paul affirming where his hometown was, where he was born. The city itself is right here, right close to the Mediterranean coast. Actually, Tarsus, they've estimated, had about nearly 500,000 people living in it during the time of Paul. So 500,000 people occupied the city of Tarsus when Paul was born and during Paul's life, which is a pretty big city, which we're going to find out in a minute. Tarsus was a major center for a lot of things for the empire. It's located in today what is Turkey, so in the southern part of Turkey in the Mersin province, right next to the Cydnus River, which runs from the Mediterranean up through here. So right next to the Cydnus River, about 10 miles north of the Mediterranean Sea. And this was actually a major international highway that ran right through Tarsus, connecting the western portion of Asia Minor to Syria, Palestine. And so running right through Tarsus was what would later be a Roman road. There's actually still bricks and cobblestones there in the Roman road connecting those two. And so it's a major roadway going right through this. So Cilicia was an important province, and Tarsus was the most important city in the province at the time. And that's where Paul was born. Just some of the history behind Tarsus, because I'm a nerd for history and I love to look at the backgrounds of cities. But in 401 BC, it was governed by King Phoenices in the name of the Persian monarchy. So it was owned by the Persians, run by the Persians. In 400 BC, it became the capital seat for the Persian province. There, the governor would have lived there. It remained under Persian control until King Darius III was conquered by Alexander the Great, which Alexander was the great Greek conqueror who conquered the known world and established what would later become the Roman Empire. And Alexander actually spent a lot of time in Tarsus as they came through and they conquered this portion of Asia Minor. He spent a lot of time in Tarsus, and while he was there, he was bathing in the river and became extremely ill and almost died in Tarsus. And so Alexander, this great conqueror, nearly died in Tarsus either because of the temperature of the water, we don't know, but he came deathly ill after bathing in the river and had to spend a lot of time there recovering. And so Alexander claimed it for the Roman Empire or for the Greek Empire and established it there. And then in 171 BC, Tarsus revolts against the Greek rulers. And then we have Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which if you're not familiar with that name, Antiochus was the ruler. He was the same person who came through. And when it talks about the abomination that causes desolation in Daniel, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which Epiphanes literally means like an appearance of a god. Antiochus called himself a god. He has actually came in, desecrated the temple, destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and sacrificed a pig on the altar of Jerusalem in partial fulfillment of the words of Daniel. So the Jews did not like Antiochus. They did not like him. And so in Tarsus, they revolt. in 171 against him. In Second Maccabees, which the Maccabees are part of the Apocrypha in between the Old Testament and New Testament, it's not in your Bible unless you happen to have a Catholic Bible. But there's some good history in the Maccabees. And it says this: while such was the state of affairs, it happened that the people of Tarsus and of Malus revolted because their cities had been given as a present to Antiochus, the king's concubine. And so Antiochus comes through, and as he's there, he chooses to rename the city after his concubine, and actually renamed it Antiochia on the Cydnus right after his concubine. The people didn't like that. They wanted to maintain the name of Tarsus. They didn't like being named after the king's concubine. And so they had this massive revolt where they revolt against Antiochus, fight against that, refusing to do that. Antiochus was a mad person. He was not the type of Greek ruler you wanted to be under. The man was a loon, bent on destroying the Jews, did some horrible things, and after he sacrificed the pig on the altar, he built a statue of Jupiter, who is the same as the Roman god Zeus, right there in the middle of the temple in Jerusalem. So this guy was not liked by Jews, so no wonder they revolted against him. So we have all this happening, this major revolt happening in Tarsus. And this is a picture of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a sculpture of his bust there. So we have, after that, the Tarsus is taken for Rome by Emperor, or by the General Pompey as he comes through. This happened about 64 BC. And afterwards, it becomes the capital city of the province of Cilicia, which is this area where Tarsus is right here, that province. It became the capital and was the home of the Roman governor of that area of Asia Minor. And so it was a very important city in the area where it was. And so later on, it took the name Juliapolis for a short time in honor of Julius Caesar as an attempt to flatter Julius Caesar. They renamed their city Juliapolis. And then after defeating Brutus and Cassius, who were part of the leaders in the assassination of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, who pursued them and defeated them, Mark Antony spent a lot of time in Tarsus. And one of the most memorable accounts with Mark Antony, it happened in Tarsus in 41 BC, was when he had his rendezvous with Cleopatra. So Cleopatra was dolled up like the goddess Aphrodite, and she came up the river in a big barge coming up into the city. And so we had this meeting between Mark Antony and Cleopatra happening right here in Tarsus. Later on, Mark Antony would actually grant freedom and Roman citizenship to all the people of Tarsus. And most of the conquered cities of the Roman Empire were slaves. And so when the Romans came through, they conquered a city, they would enslave the people. They didn't give them freedom, they would enslave them. But Tarsus, because of its importance, because of the history, because of how important it was to the region, Mark Antony came through. He didn't make them slaves, he made them free people and gave them all Roman citizenship. So there's a bunch of Jews living in Tarsus, a bunch of people living there who were not part of the Roman Empire. But when they took it over, were granted citizenship instead of being made slave. That's a big thing for them because there's a lot of perks to being a Roman citizen. And don't worry if you're not catching all the notes tonight. I will send you a copy of my notes as well. That way you have that in case you miss some things. So Tarsus, there's a long history of what's going on. It's been a very key point because of where it is on the coast, because of what it's connected to, because of the roads that go through it. It's a major connecting point in the empire. It was a very highly contested piece of real estate. And that is where Paul was born. So looking at some more. Under the Alexander the Great, Tarsus becomes Hellenized. Hellenized is a fancy academic term for being influenced by Greek culture, okay? That's all. When I say Hellenized or Hellenization, it means becoming more Greek in their culture, in their influence, in their philosophy. This right here is a picture of the Roman road coming in through a gate leading up to Tarsus. So this is actually a modern picture of what would have been the Roman road heading through there. So Alexander came through, and Alexander obviously is very, very influenced by Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, and he carried the Greek way, the Greek culture, Greek philosophy with him everywhere that he went. And so he takes over Tarsus and becomes very heavily influenced by Greek culture. Greek schools taught philosophy, and Alexander, like I said, was influenced by Aristotle. And growing up in Tarsus, Saul would have been surrounded by Greek culture. where he's been surrounded by Greek teaching, Greek philosophy, which we kind of get a glimpse of that when we get to Acts chapter 17. It's one of my favorite accounts in the life of Paul. Acts 17, as he comes into Athens, Greece, and he goes to Mars Hill, and he has this great confrontation, and he goes, I see all these statues to the unknown God, these gods, and I see one to the unknown God. And Paul actually quotes Greek philosophers in presenting the gospel. So Paul was aware of Greek philosophy, and it's because he grew up in a city heavily influenced by Greek culture. Tarsus also had a very famous university or academy, one that actually had a higher reputation than the ones in Alexandria and Athens, which is a big deal because Alexandria and Athens were the two major centers of philosophy and education, and the university in Tarsus was right up there with those two major cities. Once again, this is how important Tarsus is. It wasn't just an addition, Saul of Tarsus, in addition to his name. It was a big deal. It was a very important city in the empire. And so actually one of these students of the academy in Tarsus became the personal tutor for Emperor Augustus, one of the early Roman emperors. So it also had a famous art school. It had a gymnasium. It had palaces. It had markets. It was a city of fountains. It had a stadium. It had a theater. It had a massive library that had almost 200,000 books in it. You're getting the picture of how important and how pivotal Tarsus was. And so in Greek culture, in the best schools around, that's where Saul spent his youth. That's where Saul grew up, surrounded by this, filled with philosophy and culture and influence all around him in the city that he grew up in. And we're going to see Paul was well-versed in Greek culture. He was well-versed in multiple languages, and he had an idea at least of some of the philosophy, because we begin to see that as he mentions Greek philosophers and quotes from them in his writings. So that's some background to Tarsus. Tarsus was also a center for trade for the empire because, one, being on the Mediterranean coast, and two, being right along the Roman highway, it was a major center of trade for the area. Center of learning, center of trade on the Mediterranean coast. It was a hub for things like linen and lumber and goat's hair tents, and also for leather working. It was a very, very important trade center down the coast. And so Paul, like his father, was a tent maker. We find that out later in Acts, and likely making either leather or goat's hair tents. And that's a common practice for people in Tarsus because they're a center for the production of those things. And so that's where Paul would have got his training. His father would have got his training for his trade. So enough about Tarsus. Let's look at Paul. Some of Saul's heritage. Saul had dual citizenship. Philippians 3 verse 5, Paul writes, I was circumcised when I was 8 days old. I'm a pure-blooded citizen of Israel and a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a real Hebrew if ever there was one. I was a member of the Pharisees who demand the strictest obedience to the Jewish law. So we have Paul giving this self-description there. He was Jewish by birth, of the tribe of Benjamin. So being Jew by birth means he said, I was a pure-blooded Jew, meaning he came from Jewish parents. He wasn't a mix or an interbreed. He was a pure Jew by blood, by lineage. He's of the tribe of Benjamin, which Benjamin wasn't a huge tribe, but Benjamin was a very important tribe. And can you guess what king came from Benjamin? The very first king of Israel, King Saul, was from the tribe of Benjamin. It's likely where Saul got his name, being named for the first major king, or the first king of Israel. So Benjamin is the tribe from which King Saul came, so it held a very special place in the nation's heart. He was circumcised according to the law. Leviticus 12:3 says, on the 8th day, the boy's foreskin must be circumcised. So Saul's saying, not only was I a pure-blooded Jew, not only am I from the tribe of Benjamin, so I'm descended from the tribe that gave us King Saul, but I was also circumcised. My parents followed the letter of the law. I was circumcised on the 8th day. That was when I received my name. He was also raised as a Pharisee. We'll find more about Pharisees next week, but Acts 23:6, it says, brothers, I am a Pharisee, as were my ancestors. The King James says, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Paul had a family history and the Pharisees. We'll cover the difference between Pharisees and Sadducees, but that was part of his makeup. He was raised in that mentality, that philosophy of what it meant to be a Pharisee, how they interpreted God's law, how they interpreted society, how they looked at society. It was all the way Paul was taught and indoctrinated as a child. He was trained that way in the path of being a Pharisee. So that all influenced who Paul would later become and how he would later look at life and look at the way that Jesus works. And so raised in that tradition, he was Roman by birth. We had this account from Acts chapter 22, and Paul says, when they tied Paul down to lash him, Paul said to the officer standing there, "Is it legal for you to whip a Roman citizen who hasn't even been tried?" When the officer heard this, he went to the commander and asked, "What are you doing? This man is a Roman citizen." So the commander went over and asked Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I certainly am," Paul replied. "I am too," the commander muttered, "and it cost me plenty." But Paul answered, "But I am a citizen by birth." Now, why is that important? Why is that such a big deal that Paul emphasizes that he was a citizen by birth? Roman citizenship was a highly prized possession. It was something that was valued. Remember when I said that Mark Antony came through and gave citizenship to all the people of Tarsus, while it was the practice of Rome to conquer cities and enslave them? Roman citizenship had a lot of perks, had a lot of great things about it, which we will talk about later, but it was something that not everyone could afford to just be. It wasn't something given to every person in the empire. You didn't automatically get citizenship just because you lived in the Roman Empire. And so as we see the soldier said, "It cost me plenty," and we'll talk about the cost in a second, but Paul says, "I was born into this. I was born a Roman citizenship," which gave him a different status in the eyes of the community and in the eyes of the government. So here's how one would acquire Roman citizenship, because there's been a debate about how Paul's family received it. I mean, Paul said he was born that way, and we don't know necessarily how his father received Roman citizenship, but one thing was to have a high social or governmental standing. So coming in and being of influence in the government would afford you Roman citizenship if you were from the outside of the Roman Empire. So you came in and attain a standing in the government or in society as an outsider. They would grant you Roman citizenship as a privilege. Another way was to perform a valuable service for Rome. There's a lot of artifacts that they have found that are soldiers who fought on behalf of Rome, who may have been slaves growing up or may have come in from outside, didn't have Roman citizenship, but fought and performed a valuable service on the battlefield for Rome, and therefore the emperor would grant them citizenship because of their military service. Another way was to purchase Roman citizenship. In Tarsus, during Paul's life, citizenship would have cost 2 years' wage for a normal blue-collar worker. I actually did the math. I looked it up the other day. And at $7.25 an hour, which I guess is the common minimum wage unless it's been raised, at $7.25 an hour for 40 hours a week for 52 weeks out of the year, that's just over $15,000 at minimum wage. So let's say it was minimum wage, $30,000. How many of you actually have $30,000 right now that you could just put away and say, I'm going to use this to purchase my citizenship? If you do, I have a missionary budget that could use funding. But how could you, it was a very costly thing to purchase. When the Roman soldier says, "It cost me plenty," he's saying, I had to pay for this mess. I had to invest a lot to gain the privilege of being a Roman citizenship. And the fourth way of becoming a citizen was birthright citizenship, being born into the empire. It's what we have right now as a country in the United States, that if a person who may come from immigrant parents who are not citizens, they come here and have their child. That child, because they're born on U.S. soil, becomes a citizen by nature of birthright citizenship. So that's what Paul is saying. Being born in the Roman Empire, his parents not being Roman, but being born there, granted him citizenship. And so new citizens, when they came in, received their citizenship papers. Their names were added to a list with the province and the local register. And so the following generations were given a registration of birth that recorded their status and that they were registered as citizens on the tax table. So they got documents stating to their family, you are citizens, and from this time on. And they didn't carry papers around like I have my I have my license here, which says that I'm at least legal to drive in the state of Missouri. I have my birth certificate. I have paperwork. So I don't carry my birth certificate around with me. Obviously, that would be a little bit ridiculous. And they didn't carry their citizenship registration around with them because the claim to Roman citizenship was accepted at face value because you didn't just falsify that. You didn't say, I'm a Roman citizen and lie about it, because the penalty for that was death. I mean, you were put to death if you lied about it and were found out. They would kill you for claiming to have citizenship when it was. That's how serious it was because of the benefits and the perks that came along with being a Roman citizen. And so when Paul says, I'm a citizen of Rome, he's not going to make that claim without having something to back it up. I mean, he's not going to lie about that because the penalty was pretty severe for that. So Paul was a citizen due to birthright citizenship. Like he said, I was born a citizen because being born in a free city in the Roman Empire, he was granted that with full privilege under Roman law. And no matter how it happened to his family, that afforded him benefits in his rights. The right of citizenship guaranteed by Roman law that you had the right to a fair public trial. So you could not be convicted of anything without being judged or being having a trial in front of the public, in front of your peers. You had protection against execution without legal proceedings. So you could not be put to death without actually going through a trial and being convicted and condemned and sentenced to death. You could not just be put to death on the spot for anything. You have protection against physical punishment like whipping or beating. So right here we have Paul getting ready to get lashed in Acts chapter 22. He says, wait, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't whip me. That's why they had to stop, because Roman citizens could not be whipped, could not be beaten, could not be flogged. And you may ask, but Paul says, I received so many times the 40 stripes minus one. That's a different story. We'll get into that. But they could not just be beat by Roman soldiers because they were Roman citizens. They were protected from that. And they were exempt from certain forms of punishment like crucifixion. A Roman citizen could not be crucified. That was the most heinous form of execution reserved for horrible criminals and people who weren't Roman citizens. And we'll see later when Paul actually makes his appeal, he says, I demand to be seen by Caesar. That was the right of every Roman citizen. So if they were being brought before a governor for trial, they had the right to appeal to Caesar. And once that appeal was made, they were shipped to Rome and were seen by Caesar. That was part of the Roman law as a citizen. These are just some of the benefits there. So there's a lot of value added to the life of a person who is a Roman citizen. So now looking at Saul, his family. He had a mother, obviously. That's how he got Saul. But his mother was likely Jewish, because he did say he was a full-blooded Jew or a pure Jew. Paul indicates that in saying I'm a pure-blooded citizen of Israel, that he didn't indicate any mixing of nationalities. He was born of Jewish stock. And having a mother of anything but Jewish blood would have invalidated that claim to being a pure-blooded citizen of Israel. So we glean that from his writings that he came from Jewish parents. His father was Jewish. Some have actually debated that Paul's father was a converted Roman. That's why he had Roman citizenship. But once again, that doesn't make sense with Paul's reference to being the son of a Pharisee, because a Roman coming into Judaism would not get entrance into being a Pharisee because of the regulations. And so he could not be the son of a Pharisee if his father was a Roman. And so that whole idea that his father had citizenship before and married a Jew, and then it doesn't make sense. His father needed to be a Jew because of those things. So Paul's father was a Jew and a Pharisee living in Tarsus. His father was a tent maker. Acts 18:3, it writes this, and because he was a tent maker, as they were referring to Paul and Aquila and Priscilla, Paul being a tent maker, he would have learned every respectable Jew taught his son a trade. Typically was the family business. And so like we talk about Jesus being a carpenter is because Joseph would have been a carpenter. He would have taught his son the family trade. And so Paul, just like his father, learned to be a tent maker, had a respectable business on the side. That's how he gained a living, working with either goat's hair or with leather, making tents and building those, because it was one of the most common trades in Tarsus because of the production of the stuff. So it was a natural trade for his family to pick up. So he was a tent maker like his dad. He was a Pharisee. Acts 23:6, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. So he came from this philosophical tradition of being a Pharisee, And we'll get into that, what that means for him. And then in Acts 23:16, we learn of Paul having a sister who lived in Jerusalem, who had a nephew, which we'll hit that in another lesson. But Paul did have a sister, so we know at least he had mom, dad, a sister, and a nephew. We don't know if he had other brothers and sisters. We're not aware of that. Those are the only relatives we know of in Saul's life. Where did Saul get his name? So Saul comes from Shaul in the Hebrew. It means asked for or prayed for. He would have received that name at circumcision at 8 days old. When they're circumcised, that's when they were received their names. It was given to him likely, like I said, after the name of the first king. And so as a reference and as an honor, being named Saul, wasn't uncommon for that to happen. And then we have Paul. Now, Saul didn't adopt a new name after conversion. I used to be under the idea, I used to think that, when Saul got converted, he changed his name to Paul as a way of showing God's change in his life, but that's a complete fallacy. That wasn't the way that it is. He had two names at birth. As a Roman citizen, he had a Latin name. His name was Paulus or Paul. It was common. It was a very common Roman middle name. In fact, Romans had three names. They had a first name, a middle name, and a last name, kind of like we do. So Paul was a common middle name. We don't know Paul's full-blown Roman name, but Paul was a common Latin name where he gets that, and it is not the Latin for Saul. So it's not a translation from Hebrew to Latin of Saul to Paul. It has no relation there, okay? Paul actually means little in Latin. But it was a common practice of Jews of the time to bear two names, a Hebrew name and then a Greek or Latin name because of the culture they lived in. We have examples of this, of other people. We have Simon Peter, Simon who's called Peter. We have Thomas, one of the apostles, who says Thomas, also called Didymus, which means the twin. So you have some of those examples of two different names being in there. In Acts 13:9, Luke writes that Saul, also known as Paul, it's the first time we see the reference to the name Paul just before Paul begins his ministry to the Gentiles, which is an interesting note that from the time he begins ministering to Gentiles instead of Jews, he doesn't use his Jewish name anymore. He uses his Greek name. He's ministering to non-Jews. And so that's the first time we see the switch from Saul to Paul is when he makes the transition of no longer ministering to Israelites and Jews, but now ministering to people who are outside of the Jewish faith. And so that's where Saul got his name. He was as part of his Jewish life, he was a Hebraic Jew. Paul references to the fact, he says, I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. Now, there are two different types of Jews, okay, in the culture, especially where Paul lived. You have Hebraic Jews, and you had Hellenized Jews. Hellenized Jews means that they were indoctrinated or let in or succumbed to the temptations of Greek culture and began to mix Greek culture with Jewish tradition. A Hebraic Jew stayed very rigid to the Hebrew way of life, did not mix with the culture, did not start synchronizing the culture with their beliefs, but they resisted Hellenization, refused to let the philosophies affect the way that they taught and who they were and their worship and everything else, while Hellenized Jews started accepting everything in Greek culture. Now, remember that I said that Paul was well-versed in Greek culture. We find that out later. That does not mean that he was influenced by it. He was just aware of it. He knew his surroundings. Paul was a brilliant person when it came to ministering to people. He knew how to get in someone's head, how to touch their heart, touch their culture. And so, a Hebraic Jew attended synagogue in Aramaic and not in Greek. Paul was well-versed in Greek culture. We see that in Acts 17. I mentioned that just a minute ago. He quotes from poetry and philosophy. He was a very smart man. He was raised in Tarsus among Greek schools, and so he had access to one of the highest-ranked Greek universities of the time. He also was multilingual. He spoke Hebrew and Aramaic, of course, as a Jew, and he spoke Greek, at least 3 languages. That's more than me. And so at least he spoke 3 languages, if not more, depending because of the trade center going through that town. He may have spoken more languages. We don't know. His Jewish study, which we'll get some more into this next week, just a little bit of insight into it. He was taught by his father, as was every Jewish boy taught by his father at the local synagogue from the ages of 5 to 13, according to custom. At the age of 13, he was sent to Jerusalem. and sent to live probably with family or with people that were relatives or people that were at least close by, connected to his family, but was sent to Jerusalem to study at the school there, and would have been the Hillel school. Now, I'm not going to get really deep into it, but in Jewish philosophy and Jewish thought, there are two different traditions in the Jewish thought. You have the Hillel school and you have the Shammai school. The Hillel was founded by Hillel the elder, who was a traditionalist, and he held that tradition was superior to the law. They were a lot more lenient. And so instead of sticking to the letter of the law says this, they would add some grace, add some leniency. Well, it says this, but let's interpret it to kind of fit into tradition, to fit into the way things are working, as opposed to saying, no, it says ABC, so ABC has to happen. That's the way the Shammai school, very hard, very strict, very letter of the law. And so it despised tradition. The Torah was far superior to tradition. It trumped tradition. So you have these two different thoughts and ideologies happening. And the school where Paul went was of the more lenient, more grace side, which we're going to see some of that grace all throughout Paul's writings, right? You see how he's influenced by that grace idea. He studied under the man of the name of Gamaliel, who was the grandson of the founder of this school of thought. Gamaliel, we see in Acts chapter 5, he appears first, and then Paul mentions him later. He was a very famous rabbi, and he's not only mentioned in the New Testament, but also in the Talmud, one of the Jewish texts. In the Talmud, he is titled Rabban, which is a rabbinic title given to the president of the Sanhedrin. So Paul went to study under the man who would become the president of the Sanhedrin, the religious ruling body for the Jews. He was the first of the 7 appointed elders of the Hillel school who received the title. So he was a very, very famous man that was Paul's direct teacher. It also holds the Mishnah, which is another Jewish text. It holds Gamaliel as one of the greatest teachers in the history of Judaism. That's the man Paul sat under, one of the greatest minds of the Jewish times, the father of modern Judaism. And Paul attests to that fact in Acts 22:3. He says, I'm a Jew born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, and I was brought up and educated here in Jerusalem under or at the feet of Gamaliel. So it's a pretty good pedigree that Paul has going on here. And then, of course, Paul was raised as a Pharisee. He naturally aligned himself with the Pharisees because of the way he was raised. Taught adherence to the law, taught to the philosophy of the Pharisees. He studied under Gamaliel, who was a Pharisee himself, was the president of the Sanhedrin. So getting an idea into the background of Paul. Next week, when we get into this, we're going to talk more about the Pharisee mindset, the teachings of the Pharisees, which we'll see had some influence into who Paul was and how he taught and what he taught. And so next week, we'll talk some more about that, and then we'll jump into Paul's conversion and start into that Acts chapter 9 narrative.